Welcome to Module 22. Module 22 takes a slightly different angle in the sense that we're now going to look at a situation that may occur when your project or your interview, in this case, has been deployed. Everything's working fine, but now you need to place that interview in a website or a web page of another application. We call this embedding, embedding your interview into another web page. We're going to detail what this actually entails, how you need to authorize it. It's not something you can do straight off the bat. You have some administrative steps to take care of, and how to implement it. And we'll look at 2 or 3 different examples. So what is it? It's basically the ability to place an interview into another website or web application. Typically, this is going to involve customization of the website, usually through addition of JavaScript, or in its simplest form, a little bit of HTML. In this demonstration, we're going to use JavaScript because it's certainly the more modern and the more accepted way to do this. So this is what we're aiming for. In this screenshot, you can see, I hope, that we have an external application with all sorts of exciting things. And then right in the middle, we have Intelligent Advisor. So the end user of the website doesn't even know that there's a big Intelligent Advisor project in there. It's just a web page. It's successfully embedded. We're going to be using this Intelligent Advisor project as our example. It's a simple route finder. It asks you where are you traveling from and where are you traveling to, and then explains to you, if possible, how to get there and how long it will take. So this looks like a bit of a meaty detail slide, but it's really very, very simple. In order to do this properly, we are going to use JavaScript. We're going to leverage, as it happens, JavaScript that's already provided with Intelligent Advisor. There's a library of JavaScript called interviews.js that is in fact used every time you run an interview. You are going to write JavaScript code which will call start interview or resume interview or batch start or resume or get deployment information. You're going to choose one of these to get something done. Clearly, you've probably guessed that some of them will start an interview, some of them will start batches of interviews, some of them will resume an interview, and some of them will do something different. So basically, we're going to leverage 3 or 4 different JavaScript functions provided by this interviews.js library. Just because I say I want to resume an interview, what does it mean? Well, if you start an interview, it assumes you're starting a brand new interview. If you resume an interview, it assumes that somewhere in an external application, you have stored the snapshot of an interview that was never finished. Maybe the user abandoned after halfway, and now you want to resume it. So just saying I want to resume, fine, but it means that you would need to have a connection set up to an external application, like we saw in the preceding chapter, and that external application would have had to be configured to store these snapshots. So I guess what I'm trying to say to you is, I'm going to stick to examples involving starting an interview or getting deployment information, because resuming an interview has a lot of other prerequisites that are not relevant to this module about embedding. Notice the last point. As a JavaScript programmer, you may be interested that when the interview has successfully loaded inside your web application, you may wish to trigger further JavaScript when that's happened. So as we'll see in our examples, you have the possibility of saying, well, okay, go load the interview and tell me when you've finished loading it because I need to do something else in my external application. But there's more. When we're using the embedding idea, using interviews.js, we're actually leveraging a library of JavaScript that can do more than just start an interview. It can also handle a concept known as seed data, the ability to pre-populate something in the interview through a JavaScript function or through a URL. So you can begin to think about, okay, so I could use perhaps something that's on the page already of my web application to pre-populate something in my interview. We'll look at that as well. So let's look at the simplest possible example. Don't sweat the details, just focus on the key points. First of all, it's HTML. Secondly, the first thing you need to do is you need to bring in the script interviews.js. The third thing, of course, is this is not going to be the same for you. This is just a demonstration example. This will be your server, your instance of OPA. Then let's look through the 3 different steps in this example. Step number 1, you'll notice that I create a container called rootmapper_1. You can call it banana if you really want. I've set it to be 100% wide, given it a margin and made it float. Basically, I've formatted an empty box. Guess what? That empty box is going to be the target for my embed. The interview will be placed inside that empty box. So it's my job to ensure that the empty box is on the screen before I attempt to bring up the interview. Then comes the actual important part of the script from here on in. Select my empty box. Set the URL where web determinations are found. Set the name of the deployment. Start the interview. So those 3 steps are most important. Create a blank box ready to receive the embed. Set up the URL and the deployment name, and then start the interview. And you'll notice that when you start the interview, one of the input arguments is the empty box. So it needs to know where to place the interview on your page. That won't work unless you have authorized the website to act as an embedding target. Meaning you have to go into the hub as an administrator and go into the permissions page and select the access permissions and give permission to the website to receive your interview. Failing to do that as part of your interview access control settings will mean nothing will happen. To be more specific, you'll actually see an error message. So this is a mandatory step before you start embedding in any other web property, website, or web application. A moment ago, I briefly touched on the idea that we could go beyond simply starting an interview. We could start an interview and pre-populate some of the interview using what is known as seed data. I'm going to break it down into steps. Let's imagine that you want the starting point of the journey, since this, you'll remember, was a route mapper from one place to another place. Let's imagine that you want to set as a default a particular railway station as the starting point. And you want to do that in JavaScript. How would we do it? Step 1, in the project, give a name to your attribute. So the start, I've given a name of origin. Okay, so I've said, when you see the word origin in JavaScript, I mean the starting point of the journey. And I've selected this box to say, let it be seeded through the URL parameter system. And here's an example. Focus only on what's different. I've created an object called seed data that says origin, followed by the value of origin, which in this case is a metro station in Paris called Madeleine. And I've added seed data as an argument to my start interview. So if all goes well, the interview will start and the default value will be selected for the origin of the journey. third and final example starting an interview is sometimes you need to have more than one interview on a page. You want to have two separate interviews on a page, and they want to not interact in any way. They want to be completely independent, but they need to work properly. To do this, we are going to use, and it's no great surprise, the batch start or resume method. Batch start or resume is slightly different because it requires an object called start config, and in there it expects to find all the details of 1, 2, 3, or n projects that you want to have in your n interviews that you want to have in your page. Let's look at an example of start config. So you'll notice that it comes in two sections. That's because there are two different projects in this example. So there are two different things to be deployed, and each of them has their own start, each of them has their own empty container, and each of them has their own configuration. So in this case, this one has seed data, this one doesn't. So basically within the start batch, the start config, I beg your pardon, we're able to configure one or more than one interviews directly. The final kind of functionality that you're likely to see on a fairly regular basis is get deployment information. Maybe in your JavaScript you want to find out what is the version number or what is the active language. To do that, you will use get deployment information. You notice that it has the same basic idea, URL deployment name, but then it requires you to provide a function, and in my silly function you'll see I am just going to put in an alert message. So I'm going to pop up with the data that is received from get deployment information. Or you can also access the output and use one of the provided methods, for example, get supported locales, which is a simpler way of extracting information from the info that is returned by this function. So far, so good. Let's go and have a look at what that actually means in real life. I'm in an external application, and in this external application, I have created a page, and in this page, I have added some JavaScript. So let's go and take a look at this first example page. You will notice that in this page, let's zoom in a little bit. Oh, sorry. Let's zoom in a little bit. You will see that I have added some JavaScript. I have created a blank container called routemapper1. I grab that container, and then I use that container as the target for starting an interview. I'm starting this interview. This is the deployed name, and it is currently located at this URL. So if I now switch to preview, let's see what it looks like. It should provide me with the external application and everything else around it. 3, 2, 1, and never do it live. There we go. You will find that my route finder application, my route finder project, I beg your pardon, is successfully embedded within the application. So I'm free to choose my starting point, my finishing point, and press the next button. And it's a 7-minute journey time, and these are the stations that we travel through. So it's completely successfully embedded in the application. Let's look at a second example that uses the concept of seed data, as we mentioned earlier. In this case, I want you to notice that the default has been set to Madeleine. Other than that, it's very similar. Notice that start interview takes a variety of arguments, and even when you don't provide that data as an argument, you still need to put a placeholder for an undefined. So you need to build the start interview always with the same order of arguments, even when you're not using them. So I'm going to go to preview now. Same code, the only difference is we have seed data. And if everything goes according to plan, in, let's do it properly, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Never do a live demo. There we go. You'll notice that the interview has appeared this time round with Madeleine already chosen as my default option for the origin. The final example we're going to look at is the ability to get two examples on the same page. And in this case, you will see in my example that we are using route mapper 1 is the first container, IBAN 1 is the second container, because we are actually dealing with two different interviews, one called route mapper 19D211, one called IBAN check. So two completely independent interviews, and they are being launched using the batch start or resume method. And we'll preview that. Fingers crossed. I won't bother counting down this time. Two interviews about to come up. There we go, there's the first one, and there's the second one. So two interviews embedded within the same web application because I use the batch start or resume. Batch start or resume is good for doing multiples, but it's also good for just doing one because you can adopt the same process of creating a start config object and standardize how you instantiate interviews in JavaScript. Some additional thoughts before we finish. It is possible to use an iframe to embed an interview, but iframes are not good web practice. You have very limited options. You basically set the size and the shape and that's it. It is also possible to use a direct link, a direct HTTP GET to start an interview. And here's an example. I want you to notice that some parts are readily recognizable. You know, all this part looks okay. Seed data, you can probably tell what's happening there. I've decided to add some seed data, but the data itself is URL encoded. So you would need to find a way to URL encode that yourself. Whether it is in JavaScript or in some other mechanism, that needs to be encoded before it is passed to the user. So I could take that URL and send it in an email. They could click on it and they would bring up the interview, and Madeleine would be the default location. So what do I want you to think about? I want you to really remember three things. Embedding is all about getting an interview into some external web content. Two, there are actually several ways of doing it, but the most modern and the most standardized way is to use JavaScript, and that requires a file called interviews.js, which is provided for you. In fact, is the backbone of every interview you've ever run. And thirdly, you have a variety of methods. You can call a single interview, call an interview with seed data, or call multiple interviews with seed data. So we cover off all of the standard examples that most people need to do. For those of you who are interested, interviews.js is actually the starting point for all of the JavaScript extensions that have been covered in our website on a number of occasions and in our book about policy modeling JavaScript extensions, and will be the object of a variety of training modules coming up to a screen near you shortly. But for the meantime, that's it.